From the moment we wake up in the morning until the moment we close our eyes at night, much of our mental energy is spent trying to control life. We try to control what will happen today. We try to control how people will respond to us. We try to control our reputation, our future, our relationships, and even the smallest details of how the world should behave around us. Without realizing it, we spend an enormous portion of our lives fighting an invisible battle against uncertainty. At first, this seems natural. The human mind believes that if it can control things well enough, life will finally become peaceful. If we plan carefully enough, we think problems will disappear. If we try hard enough, we think people will understand us. If we manage every situation correctly, we imagine that life will unfold exactly as we expect. But reality rarely follows our plans. A conversation does not go the way we hoped. Someone misunderstands us. A relationship changes. Opportunities appear and disappear. Circumstances shift in ways we never predicted. And when this happens, something inside the mind tightens. We feel frustrated, anxious, sometimes even angry, not because life is necessarily cruel, but because life refuses to obey the script we wrote for it. This is the quiet tension that many people carry every day. The tension of trying to force reality to match their expectations. In the teachings of Buddhism, this inner struggle is deeply connected to what the Buddha described as attachment. The mind clings to the idea that things should be a certain way. We become attached to success, attached to approval, attached to certainty, attached even to our own opinions. And when life moves in a different direction, the mind resists. Imagine trying to hold water tightly in your hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. In many ways, life behaves in the same way. The more tightly we attempt to control it, the more unstable it feels. This does not mean that planning is wrong or that effort has no value. The Buddha never taught people to abandon responsibility or wisdom. But he pointed out something subtle that many people overlook. There is a difference between acting with care and becoming attached to the outcome. When action turns into obsession with results, the mind begins to suffer. Consider how often people worry about what others think of them. A single comment from someone can echo in the mind for hours or even days. A small criticism can disturb our peace far more than it should. Why? Because we try to control something that has never truly been in our control, the thoughts and opinions of others. Or think about how people try to control the future. We create detailed expectations about what our lives should look like next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We build images of success, happiness, recognition, stability. Yet the future is always moving, always shifting like clouds in the sky. When reality does not match the picture we imagined, disappointment appears. And slowly, almost invisibly, the mind becomes exhausted. Many people live their entire lives in this quiet exhaustion. They are constantly adjusting, correcting, worrying, planning, defending, explaining, trying to keep everything exactly where they want it to be. But the more energy they spend trying to control life, the less peace they actually experience. This is one of the paradoxes the Buddha helped people see more clearly. Suffering does not come only from difficult events. It often comes from the mind's resistance to how things actually are. When something pleasant appears, we cling to it, hoping it will stay forever. When something unpleasant arises, we push it away, wishing it would disappear immediately. But life does not ask for our permission before changing. Everything moves according to causes and conditions beyond our personal will. The seasons change. People change. Circumstances change. Even our own thoughts and emotions change from moment to moment. Yet the mind keeps insisting, this should not change, this must stay the same, this must happen the way I want. And this insistence quietly creates tension. If you observe closely, you will notice how much of human stress comes from this inner demand. The demand for certainty. The demand for recognition. The demand that life behave in predictable ways. But the world has never promised such stability. Buddhist wisdom invites us to look deeply at this habit of control. Not with judgment, but with awareness. The goal is not to blame ourselves for wanting stability. It is natural for the mind to seek safety. But the deeper question is this: what happens when our desire for control becomes stronger than our ability to accept reality? That is when the mind begins to suffer. Imagine a person swimming against a strong river current. They push forward with all their strength, fighting the water, exhausting themselves with every movement. The more they struggle, the more tired they become. Yet the river continues flowing in its own direction. Now imagine the same person relaxing their struggle. Instead of fighting the current, they begin to move with it, adjusting their direction gently, using the flow rather than resisting it. Suddenly, the journey becomes less exhausting. Life works in a similar way. When we constantly resist change, resist uncertainty, resist imperfection, we create an inner battle that never truly ends. But when the mind begins to loosen its grip, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. The tension softens. The breath becomes easier. The mind becomes lighter. This is where the wisdom of stopping caring too much begins to reveal its deeper meaning. It does not mean we become careless or indifferent. It means we stop demanding that life obey our expectations before we allow ourselves to be at peace. And when that demand slowly fades, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind discovers that life was never meant to be forced into rigid shapes. It was always meant to move, to change, to unfold in ways we cannot fully predict. In the next part, we will explore how our attachments silently create the burdens that weigh down the mind, and why learning to loosen our grip on them can open the door to a far deeper kind of freedom. If we look carefully at our daily lives, we begin to notice something subtle but powerful. Much of the stress we carry does not come from the events themselves, but from the invisible expectations we attach to them. The mind quietly builds conditions for happiness. It says things must go this way for me to feel peaceful. People must treat me with respect. My plans must succeed. My relationships must remain stable. My efforts must be appreciated. At first, these expectations seem harmless. After all, everyone hopes for good outcomes. Everyone wants stability and recognition. But the problem begins when these hopes slowly transform into emotional dependence. When our peace depends on how life behaves, we place our happiness on very fragile ground. This is what the Buddha described as attachment. Attachment is not simply liking something or caring about something. It is the deeper mental habit of clinging, the belief that certain people, outcomes, or circumstances must stay the way we want them to be. The mind begins to hold tightly, almost as if gripping something precious that must never be lost. But life has never been something that can be held still. Think about how easily the mind becomes disturbed by small changes. A friend responds differently than usual. A message goes unanswered. A plan does not unfold as expected. Immediately the mind begins to spin stories. It questions, it worries, it imagines problems that may not even exist. This is how attachment quietly creates suffering. The more the mind depends on certain outcomes, the more vulnerable it becomes. When things go well, the mind feels temporary relief. But when something shifts, and something always does, the mind falls back into anxiety. This cycle repeats again and again. In relationships, attachment often appears as the need for constant reassurance. We want people to behave in ways that confirm our importance to them. We want their attention, their approval, their loyalty to remain unchanged. Yet people themselves are constantly evolving. Their moods change. Their priorities shift. Their lives move in directions we cannot control. When we cling too tightly to the idea of how someone should treat us, every small change begins to feel like a threat. In careers and ambitions, attachment appears in a different form. People build an image of success that they believe will finally bring peace. They work tirelessly, striving to achieve recognition, financial stability, or social status. And while effort can certainly improve one's life, the mind often attaches its entire sense of worth to these outcomes. If success arrives, there is a brief moment of satisfaction. But soon, the mind creates new expectations. A higher goal, a larger achievement, more recognition. The peace that seemed so close remains just slightly out of reach. And if success does not arrive as expected, disappointment can feel overwhelming. The mind interprets failure not simply as an event, but as a personal collapse. This is the heavy burden attachment creates. It turns life into a series of emotional negotiations. The mind constantly asks, did things go the way I wanted? Did people respond the way I hoped? Did the world reward my effort the way I expected? When the answer is yes, we feel briefly satisfied. When the answer is no, frustration appears. But notice something important here. The instability does not come from life itself. Life simply moves according to countless conditions beyond our control. The instability comes from the mind's insistence that life must behave in certain ways. This insistence is exhausting. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with stones everywhere you go. At first, you may not notice the weight because you have carried it for so long. But slowly, the strain begins to affect your body. Your steps become heavier. Your movements become slower. Attachment works in the same way. Each expectation becomes another stone placed inside the mind's backpack. The expectation that people must always understand you. The expectation that success must arrive within a certain time. The expectation that life must feel comfortable and predictable. Over time, the mind becomes tired. Many people do not realize that they are carrying this weight because attachment often disguises itself as responsibility, ambition, or love. But there is a subtle difference between caring deeply and clinging tightly. Caring allows space for change. Clinging demands that things remain the same. And because nothing in life remains the same forever, clinging always leads to tension. The Buddha described existence as impermanent. Everything arises and passes away. Thoughts appear and disappear. Emotions change from moment to moment. Circumstances transform in ways we cannot fully anticipate. When the mind refuses to accept this movement, it begins fighting reality itself. But here is where a powerful shift becomes possible. What happens if we begin to loosen our grip on these expectations? What happens if we allow life to move without demanding that it constantly confirm our desires? At first, the mind may feel uncomfortable. After all, attachment has been its strategy for feeling secure. Letting go can feel like losing control. But slowly, something unexpected begins to happen. The pressure begins to fade. When we stop demanding that every situation validate us, criticism becomes easier to accept. When we stop insisting that people behave exactly as we want, relationships become less tense. When we stop attaching our identity to outcomes, failure loses much of its power to disturb us. It is as if the backpack we carry for so long begins to grow lighter. The Buddha once pointed out that freedom does not come from arranging the world perfectly. Praise and criticism will always appear and disappear like passing winds. But the mind does not have to cling to each of these movements. When the grip of attachment loosens, something very simple yet very profound becomes possible. The mind begins to experience life without constantly measuring it against expectations. And in that moment, the weight that once felt unavoidable begins to lift. In the next part, we will explore the deeper wisdom behind letting go, and why learning to release the need for control does not weaken us, but instead opens the door to a far more peaceful and natural way of living. At this point, a question naturally arises in the mind. If attachment creates so much tension, what does it actually mean to let go? Many people misunderstand this idea. When they hear the phrase, "stop caring," they imagine indifference. They imagine someone becoming passive, cold, or disconnected from life. They imagine a person who stops trying, stops loving, stops striving. But that is not the wisdom the Buddha pointed to. Letting go does not mean withdrawing from life. It does not mean abandoning responsibility or losing compassion. In fact, true letting go allows us to participate in life more fully, because the mind is no longer entangled in fear, expectation, and control. The real meaning of letting go is much simpler, and yet much deeper. It means releasing the inner demand that life must unfold exactly as we want it to. Think about how the mind normally approaches situations. When we begin a project, enter a relationship, or make an important decision, the mind quietly builds an image of the outcome. It imagines how things should develop. It imagines success, appreciation, stability, certainty. These mental images are not inherently harmful. The problem begins when the mind becomes emotionally attached to them. When the imagined future becomes the condition for our happiness, we begin resisting anything that moves differently. But reality does not consult our imagination before changing. This is why the Buddha emphasized the importance of seeing the true nature of life. Everything that exists is impermanent. Every situation arises because of conditions, and when those conditions change, the situation changes as well. When we deeply understand this truth, something inside the mind begins to soften. We no longer demand that things stay the same. We no longer insist that outcomes must match our expectations. Instead, we begin to act with sincerity while accepting that results are never completely in our control. Imagine a farmer planting seeds in a field. The farmer prepares the soil carefully, waters the plants, and protects them as best as possible. But the farmer also understands something important. The harvest does not depend entirely on personal effort. Rainfall, sunlight, temperature, and countless other conditions play their role. The wise farmer focuses on the work but does not cling to the outcome. This is the spirit of non-attachment. You still care. You still act. You still give your best effort. But the mind no longer becomes trapped in the illusion that it can control every result. When this understanding begins to grow, life feels different. The mind becomes lighter because it no longer carries the burden of forcing reality into a fixed shape. Effort becomes more natural. Actions become clearer. Instead of being driven by fear of failure or desperate need for success, we begin acting from a place of calm intention. This shift may seem subtle, but its effects are profound. Consider how many people hesitate to try new things because they are afraid of failure. Their attachment to success becomes so strong that it prevents them from acting at all. But when the mind learns to let go of rigid expectations, failure loses much of its power. It becomes simply another experience, another lesson, another movement in the flow of life. Or think about relationships. When we cling too tightly to how someone should behave, every small disagreement becomes heavy with emotion. We interpret differences as threats. But when we release the need to control others, relationships become more spacious. We allow people to be who they are, not who we want them to be. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior or abandoning boundaries. It means recognizing that we cannot shape another person's mind according to our preferences. When we stop trying to control the inner world of others, a surprising form of peace begins to appear. The Buddha often described the mind as something that can become entangled in craving and resistance. Craving pulls us toward what we want. Resistance pushes us away from what we dislike. And between these two forces, the mind is constantly pulled back and forth. Letting go dissolves this struggle. Instead of chasing every pleasant experience and fighting every unpleasant one, the mind learns to observe them with balance. Joy appears, and we appreciate it without clinging. Difficulty arises, and we face it without panic. Life continues to move, but the mind stops being dragged by every wave. This is where a deeper form of freedom begins. It is not the freedom of controlling everything. That kind of freedom has never truly existed. It is the freedom of not needing everything to be controlled in order to feel peaceful. When people first hear this idea, they sometimes worry that letting go will make them less motivated. They fear that without strong attachment to outcomes, they will lose ambition or direction. But in reality, the opposite often happens. When the mind is no longer consumed by anxiety about results, it becomes more focused on the present moment. Effort becomes clearer and more effective. creativity flows more naturally because it is no longer blocked by fear. Think of an artist who is obsessed with how others will judge their work. Their mind becomes tight and cautious. Every brushstroke carries pressure. But when the artist releases the need for approval, the creative process becomes joyful again. The same principle applies to life. When we stop clinging to outcomes, our actions become more authentic. This is why many spiritual traditions speak about the power of surrender, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Surrender means recognizing the limits of control and relaxing the mind's constant struggle against uncertainty. It means trusting that life can unfold without being forced. And slowly, through this understanding, a quiet transformation begins. The mind that once tried to dominate every situation begins to cooperate with reality instead. Instead of asking, "How can I control everything that happens?" the mind begins asking a different question: "How can I respond wisely to whatever arises?" This change in perspective opens the door to an entirely new way of living. Because when we stop fighting the natural movement of life, we begin to discover something surprising. Life itself already knows how to flow. In the next part, we will explore what happens inside the mind when resistance fades, and why the simple act of releasing control can bring a kind of peace that many people spend their entire lives searching for. When a person truly begins to loosen their attachment to outcomes, something quiet but powerful begins to happen inside the mind. It does not appear like a dramatic transformation. There are no fireworks, no sudden declaration that life has changed forever. Instead, the shift is subtle, almost like the moment when a storm slowly begins to calm. At first, the mind simply becomes less tense. For a long time, many people live with a constant pressure they barely notice. The pressure to succeed, the pressure to prove themselves, the pressure to manage every situation perfectly. This pressure sits quietly in the background of their thoughts, shaping how they respond to everything that happens. But when the need to control outcomes begins to soften, that pressure gradually fades. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Small inconveniences no longer ruin the entire day. A misunderstanding with someone no longer turns into hours of overthinking. The mind begins to realize that not every experience needs to be fought against. And this realization brings a deep sense of relief. Think about how often the mind reacts automatically to events. When something unpleasant happens, the first instinct is resistance. The mind says, "This should not be happening." It argues with reality, even though reality has already occurred. This resistance is what intensifies suffering. Imagine standing in the rain while constantly shouting that the rain should stop. The shouting does nothing to change the weather, but it exhausts the person shouting. In the same way, the mind often spends enormous energy resisting situations that cannot be immediately changed. But when the habit of resistance begins to dissolve, the experience of life changes. The rain is still rain. Difficult moments are still difficult. Yet the mind no longer fights them with the same intensity. Instead, it observes. This is very close to the awareness cultivated through meditation. In meditation, one learns to watch thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise without immediately reacting to them. A feeling appears, and instead of clinging to it or pushing it away, the mind simply notices it. And something remarkable becomes clear. Everything passes. Anger rises, stays for a moment, and fades. Anxiety appears, lingers briefly, and dissolves. Even joy itself flows through the mind like a gentle wave before moving on. When we truly see this movement, the urge to resist begins to lose its power. Life becomes less like a battlefield and more like a river. In a river, the water is always moving. If you try to hold on to one specific wave, you will fail. The wave disappears the moment you try to capture it. But if you allow the river to flow, you can move with it instead of exhausting yourself fighting against it. When the mind stops resisting, it begins to move with life in this way. Decisions become clearer because the mind is no longer clouded by panic. Instead of reacting impulsively, we pause and respond with greater wisdom. Problems are approached step by step rather than being magnified by emotional turmoil. Even relationships begin to transform. When we are constantly trying to control how others behave, tension inevitably arises. People can feel that pressure. But when we release the need to control their reactions, conversations become more open and natural. We listen more deeply. We speak more honestly. We allow space for differences without feeling threatened by them. This creates a kind of quiet harmony that is impossible when the mind is obsessed with control. Another surprising change begins to appear as well. Creativity and clarity begin to flow more easily. Many of the greatest ideas and insights arise not when the mind is forcing solutions, but when it relaxes. When we stop desperately trying to control every detail, the mind becomes more flexible. It can see possibilities that were hidden behind tension and fear. This is why moments of insight often come when we are walking, resting, or simply allowing the mind to breathe. The absence of resistance creates space for wisdom. But perhaps the most important transformation happens in how we experience uncertainty. For many people, uncertainty is frightening because it feels like a loss of control. The future cannot be predicted perfectly, and the mind dislikes that feeling. It wants guarantees. Yet life has never offered guarantees. When the mind stops demanding certainty, uncertainty begins to feel less threatening. It becomes simply another part of the natural unfolding of events. Instead of fearing the unknown, we become curious about it. And this curiosity opens the door to resilience. Life will still contain challenges. There will still be moments of loss, disappointment, and difficulty. Letting go does not eliminate these experiences, but it changes how we meet them. Without resistance, difficulties move through the mind more quickly. They are experienced, understood, and eventually released. It is like watching clouds pass through the sky. Some clouds are dark and heavy. Others are light and beautiful. But none of them stay forever. The sky itself remains open and spacious, allowing every cloud to come and go. When the mind stops resisting life, it becomes like that sky. Experiences continue to arise, but they no longer imprison us. And in this spaciousness, something very beautiful begins to appear, a quiet sense of trust in the natural movement of life. Not a blind belief that everything will always be perfect, but a deeper understanding that life can be lived without constant struggle. In the final part, we will explore what it truly means to live in this natural flow, and why learning to care less about controlling everything may be one of the greatest sources of peace a person can discover. When the mind gradually learns to loosen its grip on control, life begins to feel different in a way that is difficult to describe but deeply recognizable. Nothing on the outside may have changed dramatically. The same responsibilities remain, the same people are present, and the same unpredictable events continue to appear. Yet the experience of living moves with a new kind of lightness. This is the quiet freedom that arises when we stop trying to force life into a rigid shape. For many people, life has long felt like a constant negotiation with reality. The mind pushes, adjusts, argues, plans, and worries in an endless attempt to keep everything aligned with its expectations. It is as if we believe that peace will only arrive when every piece of life finally falls into the exact place we imagined. But life has never worked that way. Even the most carefully arranged circumstances will eventually change. Success shifts into new challenges. Relationships evolve. Health rises and falls. Opportunities appear and disappear like passing seasons. Trying to freeze life in one perfect moment is like trying to stop the wind from moving. Yet when we stop insisting that life remain fixed, we begin to discover something surprising. The movement of life itself is not the problem. The problem was the struggle against that movement. When the mind no longer fights every change, a deeper sense of harmony begins to appear. We still make plans, we still pursue meaningful goals, and we still care about the people around us. But our inner stability no longer depends entirely on whether the outcome unfolds exactly as expected. Actions become simpler. Instead of acting from anxiety about the future, we begin acting from clarity in the present moment. We focus on what can be done right now, rather than becoming overwhelmed by everything that might happen later. This shift creates a form of peace that is very different from the temporary comfort that comes from external success. It is a peace rooted in understanding rather than circumstance. In Buddhist wisdom, this understanding grows from recognizing the nature of reality itself. Everything that exists is in motion. Nothing stands still long enough to be permanently possessed. When the mind deeply sees this truth, it stops clinging so tightly. And when clinging fades, suffering begins to loosen its hold. Imagine walking through a forest with your hands tightly clenched around a handful of dry leaves. You grip them with all your strength, afraid that if you loosen your fingers, they will fall away. But the tighter you hold them, the more uncomfortable your hands become. Eventually you open your hands, and the leaves scatter in the wind. At first this might feel like a loss. But then something else becomes clear: your hands are free again. Letting go often feels this way. The mind fears that releasing its attachments will leave it empty. It believes that without control, life will become chaotic and unstable. But what actually happens is the opposite. When we stop gripping everything so tightly, the mind becomes open, spacious, and flexible. We are able to experience life more directly, without constantly filtering it through fear and expectation. This openness changes how we relate to both success and failure. When success arrives, we appreciate it fully without becoming dependent on it. We enjoy the moment, knowing that it too will eventually change. And when failure appears, we no longer see it as the collapse of our identity. Instead, it becomes simply another experience, something to learn from, something that will eventually pass. This balance brings a kind of quiet resilience. The person who no longer clings desperately to outcomes becomes surprisingly strong. Difficult moments may still hurt, but they do not shatter the mind in the same way. Because the mind is no longer built upon fragile expectations, it bends without breaking. And in this flexibility, life begins to flow more naturally. Many people spend years trying to control every detail of their journey, believing that control is the key to security. Yet those who learn to release excessive control often discover a deeper sense of stability. They move with life instead of constantly colliding with it. Opportunities are noticed more easily because the mind is not trapped in rigid plans. Relationships feel more genuine because they are no longer burdened by constant demands. Even simple moments, walking, breathing, watching the sky, begin to carry a quiet sense of completeness. Nothing extraordinary has happened. Yet everything feels different. This is the quiet beauty of living in harmony with the natural flow of life. The Buddha often pointed to the fact that peace does not come from perfect circumstances. It comes from understanding the nature of the mind and its relationship with the changing world. When the mind stops demanding permanence from an impermanent reality, a profound calm begins to emerge. And perhaps the most surprising discovery of all is this: when we stop trying to control everything, life often unfolds more gracefully than we expected. Not because the world suddenly becomes perfect, but because we are no longer standing in constant opposition to it. We begin to trust the unfolding of events a little more. We still act with care and wisdom, but we no longer carry the exhausting burden of forcing life to obey our personal script. And in that quiet shift, something very simple yet very powerful becomes possible. We finally learn how to live. Not by controlling every moment, not by predicting every outcome, but by meeting each experience with awareness, patience, and a mind that is no longer afraid to let things flow. Sometimes the deepest wisdom is not found in holding on tighter. Sometimes it is found in the courage to gently open our hands and allow life to move the way it was always meant to move.